We thought that we'd seen Brian initially come back into that home on that Wednesday. I believe it was his mom who was wearing a baseball cap.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, we're going to examine the moment that Brian's parents were told that their son was no longer alive. And not only that, we're going to go to the circumstances surrounding that and just try to get a bit of clarity, because there does seem to be a lot of confusion in many areas in the Laundrie case. And so the purpose of this episode is to provide clarity. Now, I am going to be making several references to an excellent article by Michael Ruiz from Fox News. It was published about a day ago and it was titled, "Brian Laundrie Found, Parents May Have Just Missed Discovering Son Themselves." As I say, I'll put a link to that in the description. Now, I'm going to be referring to Michael Ruiz's article here and there, just providing snippets and then highlighting certain aspects from it in order to dispel some of the myths around this idea of, how the parents sort of made a beeline for where Brian was, right? But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. You can click on the light blue icon on the bottom right of your screen. Like, share, leave a comment. Speaking of comments, there were quite a few comments on the previous video. One chap even copy and pasted a single comment about 50 times saying that the Brian's Facebook page either wasn't genuine or that someone had hacked into it, and a simple Google search would show that. Well, a simple Google search doesn't show that, and I certainly haven't seen anything debunking the account from the accounts that I follow and the information I've looked at. But upon reflection, I think there is some substance to the legitimacy question. The words "to my parents" do seem contrived. Now, what I would prefer people to do who comment to have a differing view, instead of saying someone has already said that or whatever, find that information, provide a link to that information so that we can see what you're talking about. Let's look at the credibility of the links that you're looking at so we can see whether the argument that you're making is sound. Don't simply make an argument where you disagree. Provide the source, provide either the news source or whatever the source is saying that whatever you think is a different opinion or whatever. If the account is fake, then I do think it's nevertheless an interesting thought experiment, taking that whole scenario and looking at kind of going into Brian's headspace just in a kind of an experimental way. And I think in that sense, it's sort of interesting to think, what was Brian perhaps thinking when he headed out the door? To me, the Facebook account looks legitimate based on the number of followers that are there, based on the image in the account. But I must say that last post, the black and white image of Brian, if you think about it, would Brian have posted a photo of himself as he was leaving? That part to me seems a bit odd. But it is important to think critically about these things, and this is a channel that takes an authentic view of things, and so we do want to make sure the information that is out there is accurate. So once again, if you've seen information that is credible, that is criticizing the legitimacy of that Facebook account, please put it up, certainly in the comments to the previous video. And so without any further ado, let's get started on this video. So what I wanted to do in this video is provide clarity on the visit to the park by Chris and Roberta Laundrie, because there's also been quite a lot of misunderstandings and emphasis in areas that I don't think are accurate. So the narrative I'm going to share with you deals with the events of Wednesday, the 20th of October, around about a week ago, when Chris and Roberta Laundrie went to the park, and it had just opened, and so they wanted to go and see what they could find, and then they called ahead of time. And so this article from Michael Ruiz really sketches the events that took place that morning very, very in great detail and in a very good systematic way. So the first excerpt I want to read to you is where it is written, quote, "The officer placed a hand on Chris's shoulder. Roberta wiped what appeared to be a tear from his eye, and both parents looked visibly shaken." And this is that moment. You can see Chris standing with his hands at his sides. If you look a bit further, you can see that the bottom of his trousers are kind of sodden. And, one thing that I think is really important to mention is there are some people who were very saddened by Brian's death. It sort of only deepened the tragedy of what happened to Gabby. The fact that Brian, for whatever reason, did what he did, or whatever happened to him. And I also commend people for saying that, because I think it is good to show compassion in these circumstances. I know there are a lot of people who don't like Brian, who can't stand Brian, who see Brian sort of as a cardboard cutout figure. So obviously that message would not really have a bearing on them. But there were quite a few people who said that they were surprised by this wave of sadness that sort of rolled over them. A lot of them who said they truly felt the scale of this tragedy deepening and widening. And I must say, I did too. And so you may not agree with it, but certainly this officer put his hand on Chris Laundrie's shoulder, and everyone's aware that some of the Laundries are vilified by many people. But this officer, sharing the news that his son was no longer alive, seemed to do so gently and with compassion. And I think we could do well to observe that and to take note of that. And so the quote that I've mentioned, as I say, is written by Michael Ruiz, and we're now going to go through an excellent step-by-step, blow-by-blow overview of what happened when they entered the reserve. Not through everything, just highlighting a couple of about 5 points. You're welcome to read the entire long-form article on your own time. But what we want to look at is how they entered the reserve, what they did there, and then when they left. And what you want to do is be clear on this and not take the versions that some people have given that sort of makes it seem worse than it really was in terms of Brian's parents. I know I was misled by what I read initially. So I do highly recommend reading this entire article. As I say, I'll put a link to it in the description. And what I want to do is highlight 5 crucial excerpts. And we'll start with the first one, which is actually mentioned right at the end of the article. A massive hog was caught in drone footage. And this is the quote. "On Saturday, a Fox News drone captured images of a massive hog charging through the same clearing where Roberta had paused just days earlier, at the heart of the search area," end quote. Now, I have actually searched for that footage and haven't been able to find it. So if you guys do find it, please put a link in your comments so that the rest of us can see that footage. I certainly haven't been able to find it. I do think that this massive hog is sort of the likeliest candidate, I think, for the scavenger we're looking for. Of course, things have changed. There was water there, and it was quite deep, and certainly at this point there's no water, and so the hogs are running free. When there was water there, if you had a drone, wouldn't you have seen alligators in the area? What do you guys think? That brings us to the second point. 2 Fox journalists witnessed the Laundries leaving their home, but only one followed them. So I think that's quite interesting. One of the Fox journalists remained to kind of keep a vigil on the home, and then the other, the one that wasn't a cameraman, actually left. Now one wonders if the other one had gone, if the other one who was a cameraman had gone, what sort of footage we would have gotten, what sort of, how things may have turned out. Anyway, this is the quote from the article that I want to highlight. It goes like this, quote, "When Chris and Roberta Laundrie left their Northport home before sunrise that day, only 2 journalists were present. a Fox News digital reporter who followed in a separate vehicle, and a Fox News channel cameraman who remained on their street. Now, you might think, wow, it's quite suspicious that they left before sunrise. Why did they leave, kind of in the twilight? Why didn't they leave in the middle of the day? Well, quite a simple reason, because it was still cool. I don't think it was to do with not being able to see. I think it was able to move without perspiring, and Roberta took quite a lot of water bottles so that they didn't dehydrate. So it's to go into that area and not really suffer with the incredible temperatures. It's to sort of beat the heat kind of thing. And now let's go to another quote that I want to refer to. Quote, they arrived at the Mayakachi, am I pronouncing it right? Mayakahachi Creek Environmental Park entrance at around 7:25 a.m. How is that for a accurate sort of timestamp from news reporters, right? Exactly 25 past 7 or very close to that time. And then 2 members of law enforcement arrived wearing hiking attire in a separate pickup truck. That is quite important to highlight, is that these law enforcement officers were wearing hiking attire. Now, I don't know whether that means they were in civilian clothes or whether they were wearing sort of police, police kit, but in terms of hiking. When you see the officer talking to Chris Laundrie, he seems to me to look like an officer. So I think that is perhaps the answer to the question. One later identified himself as a member of the Northport Police Department and the other working for the FBI, according to the Laundrie family attorney, Steve Bertolino. It's also a quote from the article. And so you have these 2 officers and you have 2 people that are entering the park, basically being chaperoned by these 2 law enforcement personnel. So here's confirmation that the Laundries were met at the reserve before they entered it. Now, it wasn't like a formal meeting. I'm not sure if they even shook hands. But here's where the case becomes frustrating. And this feels like another potential boo-boo by the cops. This is another quote from the article. The men said nothing at the park entrance and followed the Laundries from a distance of no less than 50 feet. So you almost get the sense, and that's the end of the quote, you almost get the sense that the Laundries arrived as agreed. And just from the article, one gets a sense that they saw the law enforcement folks there, and then the Laundries sort of wordlessly entered the park, where it is mentioned in the excerpt here that one later identified himself as a member of the Northport Police Department, not then and there, not at the time. So I didn't really get a sense that they introduced themselves to one another, just that they arrived. There was sort of a visual acknowledgement, and then the Laundries headed into the park, without really having said good morning, or without having said what they're going to do, or without having really agreed anything, right? And we know that the Laundries haven't had a friendly, expressly friendly attitude either to the media, and they haven't seemed to cooperate really very much with law enforcement, certainly not as much as people had hoped. And so this kind of corresponds with that there would be a bit of a coolness to this endeavor, if that makes sense. So they followed the Laundries once they went in from a distance of no less than 50 feet. So they were keeping their distance. And the part that's quite interesting is, if we think about this, how could this have been done differently? Because a lot of people were upset about what happened. Well, perhaps the parents could have been shadowed by each of the 2 officers. So what that would have meant was that the officers would have had to approach them, kind of confront them and say, I'm going to be your shadow today, whether you like it or not, kind of thing. I'm going to be walking with you, and this is this person, and I'm going to be walking with you, and this is that person. meaning they ought to have discussed where they were going and each of the parents paired off to a particular officer. Because both officers walked together in the park, that was ultimately what happened. And because they did that, it was no different than if they were one individual, right? Think about that. The two officers walking together while the parents were walking wherever they were going and splitting off occasionally. Well, for the whole time that the two officers stayed together, they were essentially stuck in one vantage point and stuck in one area of the park when the laundries were somewhere else, and sometimes almost out of eyesight, right? So when one of the laundries did peel off, when Chris separated from Roberta, you still had two cops essentially in the same position, caught between a rock and a hard place. That brings us to, when I say caught between a rock and a hard place, because shouldn't one decide, okay, I'm going to follow this one, and the other one, I'm going to follow that one, right? Whereas if they decided to each shadow a chosen person, you wouldn't need to make that decision when it needs to be made. So that brings us to the third thing I want to highlight. The laundries complained about being shadowed by a reporter. And so this is a quote from the article. Quote, "The parents entered the park on foot with Roberta carrying a red backpack that appeared stuffed with water bottles, the outline of which were easily seen bulging through the fabric. Chris's hands were empty and his pockets did not appear full. The couple walked at a steady pace toward the Livelong Trail," ironic name, isn't it, "just off of South Power Line Trail in Sarasota County's Big Slough Preserve. Before they entered there, they peeked into brush nearby, returning empty-handed, but complaining about the presence of a reporter and asking to be given at least 25 feet of space. And so the reporter was so close to the laundries that they actually complained about him. And I actually think, in a way, that is quite a good thing. Perhaps the law enforcement needed to be where the reporter was, right? It's good, I think, that someone was quite close to them. It seems as if the reporter was, and this is not quoting from the article, it's my comment, it seems as if the reporter was halfway between the cops and the laundry couple. And so the reporter, in a way, was providing indirectly a second pair of eyes needed. Again, the two officers walking together were little different than if it was one individual. That brings us to the fourth point. Chris Laundrie didn't go straight to evidence artifacts as many have claimed. And so to emphasize this point, I'm going to go back to the article, quoting from it. Quote, "The laundries entered the Livelong Trail next to a wooden marker labeled 149 at around 7:40 a.m. Right, so it's an exact time given, with Chris repeatedly stepping into areas of brush, popping back out at least half a dozen times, right? So that's the end of the quote. So at this stage, 15 minutes had passed, with Chris regularly and repeatedly checking the brush, checking thoroughly as he went and coming up with nothing. Basically what he was doing was a fairly erratic grid search, kind of, I guess, intuitive, thinking, maybe I'll look in here, maybe I'll look in there. Maybe I should look in there, kind of thing. And he started this fairly close to the entrance, but where he was essentially repeatedly searching as he went along. Another quote from the article, "The two law enforcement agents remained far behind, although within sight," end quote. Now, one imagines the agents simply weren't optimistic that the laundries would find anything, and perhaps regarded the excursion as a chore or sort of a dull activity. Perhaps they were bored. Perhaps they just didn't see much chance of anything coming out of it. Whether this is accurate or not, the reporter seemed better positioned to follow closely and figure out what was going on and actually record it. So I think the question is, did law enforcement record anything at that scene while it was playing out? And I think if there's a trial or an inquest, the question is, are they going to use this information from this anonymous Fox Digital reporter in lieu of nothing from the law enforcement personnel because they were too far away. And then that brings us to the fifth and final point. Chris and Roberta split up, and then both cops follow Chris. So think about where we are now. It wasn't, you remember a lot of people said that this is so suspicious. Chris Laundrie went straight to the scene. Well, we're 35 minutes into the search, and at this point the couple split up. The agents followed Chris, leaving Roberta unattended for about 12 minutes. And this is again a quote from the article. At about 8 a.m., Chris split off into an area of brush and Roberta walked up the main trail. The officers followed Chris, who rejoined Roberta without them about 12 minutes later, with his pants wet up to his knees. By then, Roberta made her way to the edge of a clearing that police later cordoned off, after telling the parents that they had discovered human remains and some of Brian's personal belongings there, end quote. So the parents actually stumbled onto this area without actually knowing it. And of course, what had changed from the other times that they'd visited the area, because they had visited the same area previously, was this time there was no water there. So this is unfortunately a crucial part of the narrative, but it's expressed a little unclearly. We don't know from this what Chris found, what the cops did to intercept him or engage with him, and what he was carrying, or even who did the cordoning off. And I may have sort of preempted all of that because I think the reporter gets to that a little bit later in the story. In any event, this is the moment one of the officers informed the couple that they'd found human remains beside Laundrie's things. Note the officer placing a hand on Brian's father's shoulder. This is the moment they were informed the youngest child was dead. I imagine the conversation went something like this. Now, we know, because it was apparently recorded, that the officer, who I think was a detective, said, "I think we may have found something." And so perhaps Roberta replied, "What did you find?" or what was it? And by way of answering the question, the parents were shown images of a backpack on the officer's phone and asked to confirm whether it belonged to Brian. They said yes. The officer then informed them that human remains had been found nearby and asked them to leave the park, go home, and wait for an update. That's also an excerpt from the article. There may also have been, questions from either Chris or Roberta saying, did you find Brian? And they may have said, we're not sure. What we found was skeletonized. The person's not recognizable, right? But it does seem like when he put that hand on Chris's shoulder, that he was either saying, and perhaps he used the words, "I'm sorry for your loss," but he was certainly communicating that by doing that. So despite what has been alleged online, look at this quote. Through their attorney, they said they had not seen anything in that immediate area at that time, and neither did the reporter present, end quote. So I want to sort of sign off on this by just saying that also it was only after the discovery of the human remains, about 20 minutes later, and this is when they were leaving this key area, we actually see the footage of Chris entering a bramble patch and later leaving with a white dry bag and a dark object, possibly Brian's damp day pack, right? So although it's still somewhat unclear, the impression I get is that they'd, first of all, been in the park for some time, at least 20 minutes, and it was only when after they were told that the remains were there, that Chris actually found something, not before. It wasn't as though he led them to the remains. It's they found the remains and then alerted them. That's how I understand it. The coverage I've seen implies that the Laundries headed to the park for the first time when it was actually the third time, arguably the fourth time, searching. They'd initially searched the same area on September 13 and 14, unattended, right? So the same area they were searching, 13th and 14th. I think that was unattended, And then again, Chris Laundrie had been, I think, asked to assist in a search in early October. I'm not sure of the exact date, but that time he was chaperoned. By the first night, by the first night that the Laundries searched, so September 13th, it was already raining, and the next day it was already inundated. So going at night perhaps wasn't the best thing, but again, probably they went when it would be cooler, and by the next day it was really too late. The area was already inundated and underwater. And so this waterlogging of the area suggests either that Brian wasn't in the area and came back, or he took his life very early on during the first day or so. I suppose another possibility is that he was trying to sit it out in the trees, and we do have some images of Brian either in trees or sort of climbing onto sort of fairly difficult to reach rocky areas. So I suppose that's possible. Also, according to the article, at 8:15, the couple turned and headed back to the entrance of the trail. It was 5 minutes after this, on the way back, not on the way out, that Chris was observed making his way through a patch of brush and picking something up. Much of the coverage I've seen juxtaposes this as the first thing that happens when the Laundries enter the park, rather than the last thing that happens as they're leaving it. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.